Hey there, AP Europeans. In this video, looking at industrialization and its effects, the effects we're going to take a look at are going to be the institutional responses and reforms that come in the 19th century, as opposed to topic 6.8, where a lot of that is just happening from social reform movements, people working outside the government. In here, we are seeing like how government actions are actually developing through the century to kind of get us closer to what we would consider to be a more contemporary, a more modern political situation. Here we go. So when we were talking about liberalism back at the beginning of this unit, back in topic 6.7, this is, I mean, there's a change that's going to happen here. The classical liberalism that we saw with Adam Smith and Malthus and Ricardo, that liberalism was designed to limit the powers of government from doing anything that would be a hindrance to economic growth and development, which is why there was really some reluctance to the government taking any sort of actions to protect workers when it comes down to the iron law of wages, which is like literally saying that workers get paid as little as possible, and that is the natural order of things until there is a reduction of the number of workers, right? By the time you get to by the time you get like decades into the 19th century, I was going to say like the later part of it, this is kind of like a slow development that comes in. The government is going to start making changes in how they approach the term liberalism, that they're seeing a change away from this laissez-faire sort of idea to more interventionist policies, because they are trying to do things to to tackle the challenges of industrialization. The phrasing on this, those challenges of industrialization, this is going to be like the need to take care of the rights of working class people. And the general thought process that comes into this is that old school Adam Smith kind of liberalism meant you were protecting individual rights, your property rights, from the government by limiting what the government would do. But now that you're to a time period with a limited government and people's rights are no longer in England, the argument is the rights are no longer violated by the government, but they are violated by the factory owners. There is a movement towards the government making decisions to actively limit those businesses in a way to try to help out factory workers, to protect factory workers' rights. So what this means is we get like a little bit more on the isms that kind of pop up on this. By mid-century, the new ism is called utilitarianism. The guy that is sort of like front and center on this, at least in the early generation of it, is a man named Jeremy Bentham. Bentham is actively writing and publishing stuff in 1789. So this is kind of like back at the days of the beginning of the French Revolution, early Industrial Revolution in Britain. And what he says for a utilitarian sort of target is that the purpose of the government shouldn't just be to, do nothing, and it shouldn't be to just like do nothing and to protect economic rights for a few. He says what the government decision should be based on is trying to achieve the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. And I think there's a little bit of logic that goes into this, that if you have a government that is trying to, I guess, not just take care of people's rights, but a government is trying to maintain some level of stability, you would want to ensure happiness and protections for the most people that you possibly can through this. And so utilitarianism, there's a little bit of a logic that I can follow here. Bentham he's considered the father of this utilitarianist movement. The guy that is kind of, I guess, like the central figure once you get to mid-century is John Stuart Mill. We saw him back in 6.8. He and his wife Harriet Taylor were actively involved in the feminist movement, the women's suffrage movement, which kind of makes sense in utilitarianism because you're talking about trying to get more control and more happiness for more people. There is, maybe a need at some point to kind of like look at some of the documents that kind of come out of this as a better way to explain what the utilitarian line of reasoning is. But for where we are right now, Bentham and Mill, these are two guys that you really want to be able to attach their name to this movement as a way of showing a reason that the government should be getting involved, some level of intervention coming into play. And this intervention that comes into play, it's got all kinds of like motivations that are influencing it from happening. One is coming from public opinion. Those social reform movements, those non-governmental organizations, they are kind of getting the word out. And as people, this is one of those where I'm copping out a little bit, and just say the people, as you get more and more individuals that are, asking for a specific issue to be resolved or a specific change to be made, governments are going to start listening to it. That sounds like politics, right? There's also going to be influence coming from prominent individuals. We saw this back in 6.8 with William Wilberforce, who is a prominent individual that is going to push for a government change. We will see this kind of coming up when you're talking about business owners late in the century and early into the 20th century. They're calling for similar changes. And this is also coming through charity organizations. The Sunday School movement is a real prime example of this because it is a charity organization that's pushing for government reform. So this is kind of the transition between those non-government groups and the government itself starting to take more action to, well, make some meaningful changes in the lives of Europeans. So let's take a look at what's happening specifically in the British system, because the British system is a little bit unique from the rest of Europe's. Because in that British system of government, as you know, they have parliament, an active, an active government body that is debating and making decisions in like various aspects of governance. And there's a little bit of an evolution that happens with this over time. So in the 1810s and going to the 1820s, there's a real wave of conservatism that comes in. This is during the Napoleonic era, and so there is a real effort to try to limit any sort of liberal changes because there was a fear that liberal changes could lead to a French Revolution happening in Britain. So two examples of where we see this in the 1810s. One is called the British Corn Laws. And this is kind of, follow me on this one. Okay. So first off, corn here doesn't just mean corn. Corn means any kind of grain. And what these corn laws did is that these are tariffs put on imported grain coming from other countries, primarily the United States. The reason that there's a tax made on these is that that tax is going to benefit landowners in Britain because it is raising the prices of imported grain, so landowners in Britain can raise the prices of domestic grain. The thing here is that those landowners that are making this money, they are noble aristocracy, and they include many of the people that were currently serving in Parliament. And so these laws are seen as such a way to benefit the members of Parliament. So in a conservative mindset, this is benefiting the status quo and preventing there from being any kind of real change because you're just funneling power into the hands of the decision makers that already had power in the first place. This is kind of like a very Metternich thing to do, if you can follow me on that from our topic on Metternich in 6.5 and 6.6. When protests started over the British Corn Laws, and when protests began to start, because this is taking money away from poor British farmers, and this is taking money away in the long run from poor British factory workers. There are a series of protests that come out of this, and the most notable of them is the Peterloo Massacre. Peterloo, like the term Peterloo, this is really just kind of like a spin-off on the Battle of Waterloo, which is like the last battle for Napoleon Bonaparte before he is put into exile once and for all. Peterloo starts with like this public protest against the Corn Laws and against other policies coming out of Parliament, but it ends with British soldiers kind of showing up to break up the rally, and I mean people die. There are a couple of dozen deaths that come out of this, and this kind of shakes a little bit of the social structure to the core. It's not quite a big enough thing to call it a revolt or revolution like we did back on 1820s and 30s and 1848, but it's enough in Britain that it starts to get attention. Gets the attention of members of parliament who are starting to see some real changes coming into play. So as a result, by the time you get to the 1830s and 40s, you start to see some changes that can be classified as liberal changes because it is getting a little bit more popular sovereignty out there to more people. So step one on this, you've got this thing called the Reform Bill of 1832. This is going to kind of do some realignment of what's going on in as far as members of parliament. What's happened is you have members of parliament that represent certain pieces of land, and as more people have moved into cities, you have members of parliament that represent land where almost nobody lives. And then you have people in parliament that represent pieces of land in the city that have tens of thousands of people living there. And so you have the consequences that you have sort of like this skew where it's kind of like the landed aristocracy, the people that are benefiting from the Corn Laws, they are in charge of what they call these rotten boroughs. Think about the rotten borough as being a congressional district or a parliamentary district where nobody lives, because there are a couple of members of parliament that are there, even though in the district that they represent, like fewer than 10 people actually lived there. So what the Reform Bill of 1832 does is it kind of shifts this around and it eliminates some of these rotten boroughs anyway, and it puts a little bit more emphasis on the urban populations having a voice in Parliament. And so when this happens, what you end up seeing is, starting in the 1830s, a little bit more attention from Parliament trying to address the urban concerns, which are the concerns of the working class, which is why you get the Factory Act of 1833 and then the Mine Act of 1842, which are dedicated specifically to try to combat the ills of child labor. They don't exactly abolish child labor, but they do kind of restrict how many hours a kid could be required to work, puts limits on that. And it kind of goes by age. Like if you are 12, you might be allowed to work a 40-hour week or more, but if you are 10, that number is going to be less. And if you are like 6 or 7 years old, you're talking in terms of just like 10 to 20 hours a week. The Mine Act does the same sort of thing specifically for coal mines. And so this is an example of like a liberal reform that is trying to address the needs of the people. We talked about over in 6.8 the abolition of slavery and of the slave trade, and William Wilberforce's movement on this. That is because there is a shift that happens in Parliament towards more urban concerns, a little bit less of the landed aristocracy concerns, and so there's a movement that kind of is like just a little bit more modern as a way, as a kind of a cop-out way to sort of sum that up. And then there is finally the repeal of the Corn Laws that come into play. The Corn Laws are repealed in the 1840s because there is recognition by Parliament that it's kind of an antiquated system and it doesn't really benefit the bulk of Englishmen. And so a little bit of a utilitarian mindset starts to come in. And there's this transition that happens here that is a slow, steady, transformative change. In the UK, it is worth 30 seconds here at most to point out that this is all happening at the same point in time that on the continent, the revolutions of 1848 are about to occur. And it is worth pointing out here that in 1848, where all those revolutions occurred, where they didn't occur was in the UK. Nothing occurred in the UK in the revolutions of 1848, and that is because there is a steady movement that is being made towards slow progressive change, and it kind of creates a little bit of a wave of stability. We'll do one more separate video on this, still looking at 6.9, but in the second video we're going to take a look at how this is going to continue to have an impact on the development and the transformation of cities. I'll see you there.